All right, so we're going to move to our next panel, which is our last panel before lunch. Our next panelists, for those in the news media, but also those in the conference, will be making news because for the first time, the Aspen Group, a cybersecurity group that consists of 36 different individuals ranging from former directors of the National Security Agency to CEOs like the CEO of IBM and J&J, to sitting congressmen that you'll hear from, to former government officials, to members of the media, to members from academia, has been studying to address the problems that you just heard about from globally from 5 of the top government officials handling these threats. They've been studying what can be done and what can be done now to address this urgent situation. And today, just 2 days after the election, we're going to hear key recommendations in terms of ensuring the safety of the Internet of Things, having a workforce that can meet cybersecurity threats, and having a framework so that the public and private can work together to combat these threats. The goal with these recommendations, which will be available on our website along with the members of the group, is to drive congressional and state action after these elections to make sure that the top threat that's been identified by the intelligence community is top of the agenda on things that'll be fixed. So please welcome 2 of the co-chairs of the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, Lisa Monaco, President Obama's former Homeland Advisor and prior Chief of Staff of the FBI and Justice Department, and Congressman Will Hurd, newly re-elected Congressman Will Hurd, former CIA, who's joining us as well today. Thank you both.
Good morning. I'm Scott Rosenberg, the technology editor for Axios, and it is my pleasure to interview you both this morning. So the election was 2 days ago, apparently, but does it feel like it was a lot more than that or a lot less than that to you, Congress?
Look, I represent the only contested district in Texas. It seems it's a fight every single day, but it's good to be back to work. Talking about something that really is actually, I wouldn't call it just a bipartisan issue, I would call it a nonpartisan issue that a lot of folks ultimately care about.
Well, thank you for making it. So before we get to the content of these reports that you've just issued today from the Aspen Cyber Strategy Group, let me step back. This group started a year ago, roughly.
Yep.
Why at that time did you, and either or both of you can answer this, did you feel that we needed another group to study this subject when there are so many bodies out there that are already examining?
So I'll start, and it's because actually there wasn't such a group. And the reason I say that is the Aspen Cybersecurity Group that Will and I are privileged to co-chair with Ginny Rometty, the CEO of IBM, is the first time there has actually been a standing bipartisan, and I like Will's formulation of nonpartisan, first time there's been a standing, nonpartisan, cross-sector cybersecurity group focusing on these issues. And I can say that with some confidence because when I was President Obama's Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor, and we were looking to make forward-looking recommendations for the next team coming in after the 2016 elections, we looked around and we didn't find such a group. So we had to create the President's Commission on Enhancing Cybersecurity, a bipartisan group that was stood up and chaired by Sam Palmisano and Tom Donlin. But they came together, they made their recommendations, and then they disbanded. And so I thought it was really important, and this is why I wanted to be part of this, to have a standing group that could exist after, not be a one and done situation, come together and, very importantly, bring and build the bridges, which I think is a great theme from this morning, build bridges between government, private sector, academia, civil society. And that's what we have decided to do. And Will and Ginny and I decided that the first year's focus for our group ought to be on three things. How do we enhance security and transparency around emerging technologies like the Internet of Things? How do we better enable operational collaboration between government and private sector? And how do we have some strategies to fill the gap, the real yawning gap in the cyber workforce? And so those are the things that we're talking about, and we spent the last year with this group focusing on, and that's the set of recommendations along all three of those dimensions that we'll be making today.
I approve Lisa Monaco's message.
Good.
I think General Keith Alexander, the former head of NSA and a member of our team, said it best once. If the federal government thinks they can defend themselves against this threat by themselves, or the private sector can defend themselves against this threat by themselves, it is the equivalent of the French thinking they can defend themselves against the Germans by the Maginot Line, right? And there wasn't an entity. All these conversations are happening. Academia with the private sector with government, government with academia, but there's never been everybody in the same room. And then you get some of the key players in a room and say, listen, why can't we solve this issue of ensuring the right number of people have the security clearances to get the information from Department of Homeland Security that you need in order to defend our financial services sector? And we can work through those issues. Then you have folks that were doing this and are unencumbered from the heavy task of that job to be able to give that perspective on where we've come and how this really works. And so this is what this entity has been able to do. Look, I can say personally, because of our first conversation and the conversations around artificial intelligence, I went back and the committee that I'm a chair of, the subcommittee I'm a chair of, we did a series on artificial intelligence. And it ended up being, I've held half of the hearings in Congress when it comes to artificial intelligence. And that's a direct line because of the conversations amongst people that are involved in dealing with the threat of cybersecurity, dealing with the threat of emerging technology every single day. And this is, we always say this is a do tank, not a think tank. Yeah. And so the idea was, how do you produce a number or a set of requirement or set of tasks that we can say, actionable. There's someone that can follow up on this. We're able to evaluate whether this gets done or not in order to make sure it's not just one more group that are saying wither cybersecurity.
And towards that end, and Will's absolutely right, and that's why I'm so privileged both to be here on stage with him and to serve as co-chair of this group with him, because of those conversations, he can take action on that by driving the conversation, as I think you have so ably done in Congress over the last year on, for instance, artificial intelligence. And so one of the other things our group has come together to do, and that we're releasing today, is a set of security first principles for the Internet of Things. Actionable, clear, digestible, one page of 7 principles that we believe that our very disparate and diverse group of thinkers and leaders on this group all have come together to say, these are the things that ought to be guiding manufacturers, designers, and consumers to understand about the Internet of Things devices that they buy. Security baked in, transparency for the privacy attributes and the security attributes of a particular device, accountability, whether or not there's security both in the device and at the network layer. So a whole series of basic first principles that we think ought to be driving the conversation and consumer awareness around IoT.
So those principles, can you give us an example of how one of them might be kind of, so the report came out this morning, today?
Yep,
and so it's out there now, and it's nice and short.
Yes.
It's a
you should love that. Axios,
yes,
smart brevity, right?
Exactly. So
you're welcome.
Thank you. So how would they make their way into the world and into the world of practice?
So I'll give you an example. So one of the principles is there ought to be transparency about what security is baked in to a device and transparency about what privacy that device affords the information that you give it. So it ought to be clear what information it is gathering as you use it, what it's doing with that information, what information is it sending back out into the world. And we think that there ought to be transparency about those attributes, transparency about the security attributes. So things like, what are some of the things that could lend that transparency? Is there something like a nutrition label, right, for a particular IoT device? Should there be some type of standard or a kind of seal of approval, like in the underwriter's laboratory approach? These are all ways that you might have transparency around these things. We're not mandating it. We haven't said there's only one way to do this, but there ought to be a mechanism for that transparency, and that's the conversation we want to drive.
And let me give an example when we talk about operational collaboration. Operational collaboration is how does the public and private sector work together in order to defend against attacks? Well, first, there was an unclear understanding of the roles and responsibilities of everybody within that value chain. So we took a framework and said, here's how we're going to describe operational collaboration, and let's already use something that's already out there. The public sector and the private sector work together closely on a lot of emergencies when it comes to homeland security. So let's use that model and adapt that for this issue. And so we try to describe collaboration within two states: a steady state, every kind of day, and then a crisis state. And what are those enablers that are unique across, or the same across both of those two states? And one of those is on information sharing. Most people in Washington, D.C., when you talk about cybersecurity, the first thing they say is information sharing. Well, what information, right? And the private sector shares a lot of information into the government, but the government doesn't do a very good job of getting that information back in their hands. And so one of our criteria or task was create criteria for private sector participation in full cycle intelligence relationships. What does it actually mean? The financial services industry has a better idea where the next Russian malware is going to come from and what they're going to attack than my friends in the NSA do. So let's turn those assumptions from the private sector into collection requirements, task that across the people that can collect on nation states, and that's another nation state, and then once we get that information, get that back in the hands of the people that need it to defend, right? And so this is something that's perfectly and squarely in DHS's role. A guy like Chris Krebs, who's running NPPD there, saying, how do you work with the ISAOs or ISACs, information sharing and analysis centers across different industries in order to make sure that back and forth is actually happening, and who should be the people that are involved in that back and forth? And we lay out some suggestions for that.
Do we run the risk of winding up with a system that is too complex there? Do we need something simpler and more centralized, or do we need to spread things out more?
The threat is not centralized, so the response can't be centralized. If we think we're going to be able to have, 3 smart people in the back room figuring out with their wizard caps on, figuring out how to defend, we're going to be wrong. And every industry has a little bit different, and it's moving at the speed of light. And so if you, anytime you sit down and say, this is the procedure, that procedure is already old by the time the ink dries on that piece of paper. So making sure you know what the rules are, making sure that if you're a big bank and something happens, who can you call? Who do you call when it's not a crisis? Who do you call when it is a crisis? And what is the expectation if it's something that's happening to our financial service industry or our utility grid? who's going to come in and what are they going to do? And are they going to sit down at a computer and get on a network? Are they not? And making sure that we know who those players are and what their roles are going to be allows for the flexibility to deal with whatever the threat ultimately is. Our friends from Five Eyes made it, what they said earlier, good digital hygiene.
Yeah.
Long password, right? Don't click on stuff you're not supposed to click on, right? You do those things. We're going to defend against 85% of the threats, and making sure you have that resiliency within your networks is important.
So you both have a ton of experience in different aspects of this. Where are the biggest sort of friction points in, like, why haven't we gotten further with this already? As you published this report now, it's going out into the world. Where are we going to see the biggest sort of pushback and resistance?
Well, I think that one of the biggest concerns, and I heard when I was still in government, is private sector doesn't know who to call. What's the one belly button to push when they face a breach? Now, the FBI has done great work, as has DHS and others, establishing relationships, particularly with the financial services sector or other sectors of the economy. And so, those relationships take time to build up. And we shouldn't do anything to disrupt those relationships. But what is the larger framework? I think Will's effort on operational collaboration that he's just described are a very helpful framework around what are the existing rules and responsibilities that government has. So several years ago, the administration put forth something called the Presidential Policy Document 41. Typical, lovely government acronym, can't make it simple. But what it did is it laid out very simply, here's the FBI's role, here's DHS's role. FBI is going to come in and be the first responder, as it were, in terms of investigation, particularly around nation-state attacks, which are all too prevalent nowadays. And DHS is going to help you address and mitigate the effect of that malicious actor on your system. So being very clear about what these roles and responsibilities are, but we don't want to do anything to disrupt the very good existing relationships that have built up over time and that we need more of.
I'll take the last part first. The friction, what are people going to say? Some people will say, maybe you don't go far enough, right? And that this is, you're not pushing the envelope further enough. That you're always going to have those kind of detractors. What has prevented some of this cooperation? I would say the biggest frustration now between the kind of collaboration you need between the public and the private sector is clearances, and how those get issued and who gets access to what, and the classification of data and whether that can be shared. Intelligence needs to be actionable, and it needs to be relevant to the situation at hand. Having something that's 3 months old is of absolutely no value, and the government needs to change their opinion on the perishability of intelligence, especially when it comes to cyberspace. When it comes to human intelligence of other kinds, look, I'm a case officer. I was an undercover officer in the CIA. I was the dude in the back alleys collecting intelligence on threats to our homeland. I'm a proud humanter. I'm a proud member of the National Clandestine Service. That's different than the stuff that we have in cyber. It moves so quick and it's so perishable that we have to get in the hands of people. And that has been the biggest frustration, and is what is getting in the way from the kinds of collaboration that we need in order to make sure that we're defending against this diverse threat. And it is something that I wish there was one person in the federal government that could change this thing, because guess what? There isn't. We've been trying to find them. If I knew who, if there was one, I'd be in their door every day.
Well, the road to this process is littered with DNIs, the directors of national intelligence, who have tried to conquer this. So,
to get to this kind of collaboration, you obviously need to have good relationships between industry and government. Past year, we've seen the start of a kind of new round of contention and conflict between many of the technology companies and government, sometimes driven by employees concerned about specific projects, or sometimes driven by some political conflicts that have emerged. How do you see that? Is that going to be an increasing problem in trying to keep this collaboration going?
I don't know if it's going to be an increasing problem, but I would say that actually in Washington and Congress specifically, there's a shared concern amongst Republicans and Democrats. My friend is from Texas, is here, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas, someone that I look up to and has been a mentor to me, who serves on the House Judiciary Committee. And there's going to be an interesting conversation with the CEO of Google in the next couple of weeks. And I would say that you're going to see some of the similar concerns from Republicans and Democrats on how an American company is interacting with its government. And ultimately, look, we all know that our American companies are not just American companies, they are driving the conversation in this industry. And guess what? We want that to continue. I don't want to have to use a Russian version of Facebook, right? I do not want to be using Chinese routers for anything, okay? And so we want to make sure that our American companies stay strong, but we also have to make sure that level of cooperation is a two-way street between the public and the private sector.
Look, we're 2 days out from this election. Obviously, there's going to be a huge changeover in leadership positions, obviously in the House, but there will also be a big change in membership on various committees, both in the House and the Senate, and there'll be a big shuffling. I'm hopeful. What I hope is the congressional agenda on cybersecurity is that it has at least 3 attributes, right? That it is bipartisan. Our friends from the Five Eyes said this quite clearly. Our biggest vulnerability is weak cybersecurity, right? And that ought to be something that we can come together on as a country and do things across the aisle. So it ought to be bipartisan. It ought to be prioritized, right? And it ought to be fact-driven. Right? Let's focus on what are the top threats, what are the biggest areas of concern, where can we have some bipartisan approaches. So some examples, we ought to be doing more, God willing that the initial reporting is correct and the election security was without incident over the last 2 days. I know you're particularly concerned about that.
People still didn't learn how to count properly, but that's a whole other thing.
But we ought to be making sure that we're doing everything we can to shore up election security for 2020, right? This is not a threat that's going away. This can't be a one and done in terms of one set of funds to the states to help them shore up cybersecurity. There needs to be a sustained effort and framework going forward for years from now so that the states can make sure that they're able to keep up with a very fast-moving and evolving threat and not have, Georgia, one of 5 states that doesn't have paper backups, right? I mean, and, having a federal judge call Georgia election officials saying that they have their head in the sand, right? That is not a good state of affairs when it comes to ramping up to the 2020 election. So we ought to be coming together around election security, around supply chain security, and around leadership in the federal government on this issue, right? Restoring the cybersecurity coordinator. I don't want to call out my friend Rob Joyce, but served very ably in that job, and I have just called him out. But there needs to be, a leader that can coordinate the federal government's efforts from the White House on these issues. So there's a real agenda here that ought to be able to be bipartisan.
Congressman,
I would just add that past behavior is a good indication of future behavior. On this issue, it's been incredibly bipartisan. Robin Kelly from Illinois has been excellent on this. Jerry Conley from Virginia. Right before last election, Steny Hoyer was a co-sponsor on my signature piece of legislation. Right. This is already the muscle memory is there to actually work together. And some of the things that we're going to be talking about in the new Congress, 116 Congress, GDPR. Mm-hmm. is it working? Is it not working? Is this something that we may need to be moving to, right? And a year ago, the answer would have been not only no, but probably hell no. I think more people are open to that because of some of the breaches. Artificial intelligence, Vladimir Putin, we all know that, what he said on this. We don't have a national strategy on AI. I actually believe Congress can be working on something together and push this forward and drive the administration's thinking on this. I think that's something that's incredibly important. And then, again, making sure that the federal government is following good digital hygiene is important because of the amount of data that we have access to. And ultimately, where the conversation should be, we shouldn't be talking about how does the public and private sector in the United States of America be working together. We should be talking about how do we and our allies work on this topic together. Now, when it comes to fighting a very specific issue, of course, our intelligence services are doing a good job, but how do we do it in a more programmatic way and get beyond a transatlantic divide on what privacy really is? Guess what? We support privacy, right? You know, everyone wants to talk about it in a different way, but we need to be talking about how we do this with our allies as well, and it's going to make all of us more resilient.
Lisa, you talked about prioritization, and looking ahead now to the next, I mean, we have another election in 2 years.
Can we wait? Can we just talk about the current one? We just got through one. We always got to talk about the next one.
We always have to talk about the next one.
Lord have mercy.
You're a member of Congress every 2 years, right?
Is it every 2 years? No, I'm joking.
Yeah, you better get back to work there.
But what would you, looking ahead, think of as the #1 problem in cybersecurity for the next 2 years?
Well, for the next 2 years, as I said, I think making sure we don't have a foreign adversary able to attack the very underpinnings of our democracy at our next election is something we ought to be putting very high at the top of the list, right? I think Will's absolutely right, and his leadership on AI and other emerging technologies in the House has been really tremendous. Our country needs a very clear research agenda, and we need to be willing to fund it and to work with, we sent folks to the moon. We've done so much great innovation in this country by having partnerships between the government and great researchers and innovative minds in this country. We need to do that when it comes to emerging technology that is going to be driving everything we do and is already when it comes to AI. So research agenda, election security, and supply chain, and of course IoT security. All of those things, I think, fit in the basket of things we ought to be focusing on.
I'm going to get, in the next 42 seconds, I'm going to give you a 1A and 1B. 1A is a national plan on artificial intelligence. The future of cybersecurity is good AI versus bad AI, and whoever gets there first is going to make sure they're able to be prepared. Second, 1B is we have to sort out this issue of classification of information within a cyber realm so that we can achieve true information sharing, and that information sharing should be the basis of operational collaboration between the public and private sector, not the end destination or the goal.
You timed it
Bingo.
perfectly.
Right
We're out of time.
Right on the nose.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us for a great morning of discussion. I want to give a little bit of information on lunches. You have all received emails that I hope will help orient you. We're going to break up into a bunch of small roundtable discussions. There are 2 lunch discussions here in the back of the room. One that PwC is hosting about data breaches, one that Accenture is hosting about supply chain cybersecurity risks, both of which we've heard a lot about already this morning. Downstairs, under the forum, is David Sanger is going to be giving a book talk on his new book, The Perfect Weapon. And then in the far corner, there's going to be a lunch discussion about countering terrorism online and ISIL, countering ISIL online with Jennifer Buckner, who's Brigadier General and head of Army Cyber Command, and then John Carlin, who you have seen on stage already today. So anyone who is heading to that luncheon or the boardroom, donor room luncheons, please follow the signs. Grab your box lunches out here, and then we'll see you back here in about an hour. Anyone who wants to eat outside, please go ahead and do so. There's a beautiful day outside.